The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Glory to you, O Lord. As Jesus was passing through a field of grain on the Sabbath, the disciples began to make a path while picking the heads of the grain. At this, the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and he and his companions were hungry? How he went into the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of offering that only the priest could lawfully eat, and shared it with his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That is why the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Today is the memorial of Saint Anthony, otherwise known as Antony, the father of monasticism, or the patriarch of monks. He died, if you believe, at 105. In the year 356, he was a hermit and a monk, which is why he's called the father or patriarch of monks or religious life, really the founder of religious life in that early century. He worked with St. Athanasius against the Arianism heresy, and is recognized and is obligatory memorial today, I suspect because of his role so early in the church and it happened really at that time, that beginning with Anthony and others, that these groups would go into the desert and they would begin to pray. Again, we might look at that today and say, well, gosh, that's so odd. And yet, look at the fruit. Look at the benefit that they've given to the church as agents of God. We recognize Anthony then in the long history of monasticism and Benedict. St. Benedict is also known famously for the Benedictine rule, for instance. So for all the good that society fails to recognize in those who live cloistered monastic life, they literally give their lives to God in prayer. It's a different kind of life, and it's a fruitful one. Sometimes you wonder, well, where do all the graces come from? It could be coming from all those unnamed and unknown people who are simply praying, perhaps generically or perhaps very personally, for all of us. Thank you today, Lord, for St. Anthony. Not the same Anthony who likes to find things, but Anthony, well, let's say, St. Anthony of prayer. St. Anthony the Hermit. Perhaps we could have Anthony come today and enlighten us on this first reading from the letter to the Hebrews. That's kind of a mouthful. If we really break it down, it might be helpful to hear now and again that God knows. God knows the good work that you're doing on behalf of God. And maybe the work is simply your love for God. You're desiring to love God. We all fail at that. We fall down, we get up. We're never going to be perfect at it. But God recognizes and honors. God collects, if you will, all the acts, great or small, of love and goodness that we do because of God, because of God's name, because of our desire to love God, how well or at times how poorly we might do that. It also tells us in a roundabout way that God makes his promises. And God can only, it's odd even to hear the phrase that God swears at all, but that God can only swear by the divine name, which is immutable, that is unchanging. Who else, upon whom would God swear? By my own name, God says, my unchanging name, I promise. And God fulfills that promise. He fulfills the promise to Abraham that he would become the father of a great nation and a father of a child with Sarah. That also was a promise. and all through the Old Testament, Moses and the major and the minor prophets, it's unchanging. God's intention is unchanged from the beginning. As many times as we fall down and get up and we fail and we sin through the history of civilization and all humanity, God is unchanging. God makes the promise, and God has and will continue to fulfill it. More often than not, as a human race, we kind of get in the way. Have you noticed that? Notice here the example of the Pharisees and the Pharisees against the disciples. It's paired with this anecdote of the Sabbath. God gave the law, in this case, the law of, is it the second commandment? Or the third, thou shalt make holy the Sabbath. God gave that law and all the other 10 commandments for our good. We did not make the laws or rules. We made a lot of rules of our own so that we could do them for God's purpose. No, God did it for us for His purpose, for our good. The Sabbath really comes originally, pun intended, from the beginning that we honor God on the seventh day for the work of creation. Was God tired? No, God doesn't get tired. But God deserves to be honored. We need to rest, literally rest, sit down, sleep if you have to. The wisdom of that goes forward with Moses and the Egyptians and the exhaustion of many of the Israelites that died because they worked 7 days a week, hard in hot desert-like conditions. They needed rest. But not only physical rest, but human and emotional, psychological, and spiritual rest, so that we physically rest on, what we know now as Sunday, so that we can ponder and reflect, where are we with the Lord? Where is the Lord with us? That's the wisdom. That's the gift of God to us for our length and strength of day and our well-being in the Lord. But now we have the nitpickers, the law pickers. Hey, they're not keeping the law. Do you think that bothered God? What's the law that they're breaking? They were working because they picked grains of wheat off the sheaves and they were eating them. I'm not sure how good that tasted, but they were hungry. It's not that they were eating the grain, it's that they worked to pick it off, so that they were offending the commandment to keep holy the Sabbath and do no work. Again, Jesus tells the parable, well, don't you take your donkey out of the stall or your cow and walk it for water and give it food? You're working. God can't take a day off. So we kind of have these nitpickers. We all do that in our own way, don't we? Yeah, sorry. But to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. Jesus did not come to form and create a religion. He came to form a new social order. It's so common and so simple we forget. We exist to love. We exist to be loved. Again, pretty simple, but hard because of the disorder and the confusions of sin. Well, if somebody's not doing their job because I don't feel very loved, so I don't love very well because someone's not doing it for me. Who's going to go first? God always goes first. God initiates. God offers the invitation. We, by God's wisdom, have the choice to choose, to respond. Well, God, I'd rather go my own way. Let's see how that works out. Usually not very well. God is unchangeable, unmutable, ineffable, unnameable love. It's beyond our understanding. As we celebrate and worship this day, we're working on God's behalf, and that work is to give God glory. That we're honoring God by gathering and praising and worshiping, and then in some way, in some tiny way, becoming more like God through Christ in our hearing the word and receiving the sacrament. May that sacrament bear its fruit today, that we put just a little bit more love in the world. May God be praised in the life of St. Anthony, and may we glorify God by our love for God, ourselves, and many others.
Let us pray.